April 6, 1945, Okinawa. The dawn breaks pale and uncertain over the East China Sea. A young pilot named Takeshi Nakamura sits in the cockpit of his Mitsubishi A6M0, hands trembling not from fear but from the weight of sacred purpose. Around his forehead, a white hachimaki headband bears the rising sun. In his flight suit pocket, a final letter to his mother, written in careful characters that speak of cherry blossoms and eternal honor. The engine coughs to life. Salt air mixes with aviation fuel. Below, on the carrier deck, his commander bows deeply, a gesture reserved for the already dead. Takeshi does not return it. He is no longer a man. He is a bullet wrapped in the flag of the divine wind. Across the Pacific, in the steel guts of an American Sherman tank grinding up a muddy Okinawan hillside, Corporal James Sullivan from Pittsburgh chews on a piece of hardtack and checks his ammunition count for the third time that hour. He does not know that in less than 20 minutes, a 19-year-old philosophy student turned pilot will attempt to erase him from existence. He knows only the mathematical certainty of his orders: advance, hold, advance again. The tank's radio crackles with static and distant voices. Someone is singing "Don't Fence Me In" off-key. The war has become routine, even here, even now, even as the Empire of Japan prepares to throw itself like a moth into flame. The Kamikaze, divine wind, took its name from the typhoons that twice scattered Mongol invasion fleets in the 13th century, saving Japan from foreign conquest. By 1944, as American industrial might closed like a vice around the home islands, Japanese military leadership embraced this ancient salvation as modern doctrine. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi formally established the Special Attack Units in October 1944, transforming desperation into theology. The mathematics were simple and terrible: one plane, one pilot, one ship. Japan's depleted air forces could no longer achieve air superiority through conventional combat. American pilots were better trained, their aircraft superior, their numbers overwhelming. But a plane loaded with explosives and guided by human will, this became the final equation of sacrifice. The pilots were told they would turn the tide. They were told that their deaths would multiply into tactical miracles, that American morale would shatter beneath the weight of such devotion, that the invasion fleets would turn back rather than face an enemy willing to weaponize its own flesh. They were told that one man's sacrifice could sink a carrier, kill thousands, change the trajectory of battles. They were shown grainy footage of successful attacks, ships burning like offerings to the sun goddess Amaterasu. They were not shown the ratio. For every ship damaged, dozens of pilots evaporated into the sea without making contact, shot down by curtains of anti-aircraft fire, intercepted by combat air patrols, or lost to mechanical failure and the vast indifference of the Pacific. Takeshi expected transcendence. He expected his death to matter with the weight of mountains. In the final briefings, the instructors spoke in poetry and strategy intertwined, how the Americans valued life too highly, how each kamikaze attack would force them to calculate the cost of invasion in their sons and brothers, how the accumulation of divine wind strikes would create a barrier more formidable than any fleet. The numbers supported the mythology at first. At Leyte Gulf, kamikaze attacks sank the escort carrier St. Lo and damaged dozens of other vessels. At Iwo Jima, they struck with increasing frequency. The Americans bled. The kamikaze doctrine seemed to work. But Okinawa would reveal the terrible truth: that sacrifice without strategic impact is merely death. That devotion cannot overcome production.
that the divine wind breaks against American steel not because the wind lacks conviction, but because the steel is simply too plentiful to matter. The defensive line Takaishi's mission aimed to support was already crumbling. On the ground, Japanese forces had dug into the Okinawan limestone with the ferocity of men who understood this was the final threshold. The Shuri Line, the Makinato Line, fortifications carved deep into coral and earth, designed to bleed the American advance into strategic paralysis. Every cave a tomb, every hillside pre-registered for artillery. The Japanese doctrine expected the Americans to break against these defenses as waves break against breakwaters. They expected that the combination of entrenched infantry, kamikaze attacks from above, and sheer willingness to die would create conditions impossible to overcome. They did not account for what James Sullivan and tens of thousands like him represented. Not merely soldiers, but the end products of an industrial base that had transformed warfare into logistics. For every Sherman tank destroyed, 3 more rolled off assembly lines in Detroit. For every Marine killed, 2 more arrived on transport ships whose production schedules ran with assembly line precision. The Americans did not fight harder. They did not possess greater warrior spirit. They did not embrace death with poetic fervor. They simply had more. More tanks, more shells, more fuel, more replacement parts, more of everything except time to waste. Sullivan's tank advanced not because of superior tactics or individual heroism, but because when it was disabled, another tank pushed forward. When that one struck a mine, a third continued the line. The radio traffic was banal. Grid coordinates, ammunition status, requests for fuel. The American war machine did not operate on mythology. It operated on supply chains. Takeishi's Zero screams down from 11,000 feet, the dive so steep that his vision tunnels, blood pulling toward his boots. Below, the American fleet spreads across the ocean like a city made of steel. He aims for a destroyer, then adjusts for a larger target, a cruiser perhaps, or a transport. The anti-aircraft fire begins as distant puffs of black smoke. Then suddenly, he is inside a storm of tracer rounds and explosive shells that turn the air into shrapnel. His plane shudders, the windscreen cracks. He pushes the stick forward, committing to the geometry of his death. A 5-inch shell from the USS Hazelwood detonates 17 feet from Takeshi's aircraft. The Zero disintegrates into burning fragments that scatter across 300 yards of ocean surface. There is no impact. There is no explosion aboard an American vessel. There is no tactical consequence. There is only water, accepting aluminum and flesh with equal indifference. The radio operator on the Hazelwood marks the kill on his tally sheet. It is the 4th this morning. The sun has barely risen above the horizon. This scene repeats with variations across the battle space. Of the 355 kamikaze sorties launched on April 6th, the first day of Operation Kikusui, the floating chrysanthemum offensive, only a fraction reached their targets. American combat air patrols intercepted many before they approached the fleet. The layered defense of radar-guided fighters, then ship-based anti-aircraft guns, then close-range weapons, created a gauntlet few survived. Those that did hit ships often struck vessels designed with compartmentalized damage control, with firefighting teams trained to contain blazes, with repair crews who could patch holes and restore function within hours. The Kamikaze achieved tactical successes. The American fleet at Okinawa suffered more casualties than any other naval campaign of the Pacific War, but they could not achieve strategic victory. They could not stop the advance. On the ground, Sullivan's tank column reached the outskirts of Naha against resistance that seemed to intensify and weaken simultaneously. The Japanese fought with suicidal determination from every cave and every ridge. But determination without resupply is a finite resource. The Shuri Line, which Japanese planners believed would hold for months, began to fracture after weeks of sustained American artillery bombardment. The Americans fired shells at a rate the Japanese could not comprehend, industrial quantities of high explosives delivered with the regularity of factory shifts. When Japanese observers reported the barrage densities, commanders initially refused to believe the numbers. Surely the Americans could not sustain such expenditure. Surely they would run out. Surely. But the shells kept coming. The tanks kept advancing. When Marines fell, more Marines arrived. The replacements were younger, less experienced, more frightened, but they were numerous, and they brought with them ammunition and rations and fuel in quantities that seemed to violate the natural laws of scarcity that govern Japanese logistics. A captured Japanese officer, interrogated after the fall of Shuri Castle, expressed not anger but bewilderment. "We calculated your losses. We knew how many men you lost each day. Where did you keep finding more?" The answer lay not in Okinawa, but in Oakland, in Philadelphia, in the Great Lakes training facilities, where a nation of 140 million civilians had reorganized itself into a production economy that treated war materiel like agricultural output, measured in tons and units and delivery schedules. While Japanese factories scraped together resources to build planes from wood and fabric, American factories produced aircraft with the standardization of automobile manufacturing. The B-29 Superfortress, each one requiring 55,000 separate parts, rolled out of Boeing plants at a rate of 16 per day at peak production. The absurdity of it only became clear when viewed from the Japanese perspective. They fought an enemy who could lose battles and still win, who could absorb casualties that would cripple the Japanese war machine and request more troops as casually as ordering office supplies. The Kamikaze pilots were not cowards. They were not fanatics, at least not all of them. Many were university students, poets, sons of farmers who understood both duty and the probability of their deaths. Their final letters reveal young men who saw clearly what was being asked of them and chose to comply not from bloodlust, but from a complicated mixture of cultural obligation, genuine patriotism, and the absence of acceptable alternatives. To refuse was to shame your family, to betray your nation in its darkest hour, to mark yourself as less than human. So they flew, and they died, and the American ships kept coming. The symbolic object that haunts this narrative is not a weapon, but a meal. American soldiers ate from standardized rations that, while hardly gourmet, provided caloric abundance that Japanese troops could not fathom. The C ration, the K ration, the D ration chocolate bar, each represented not merely sustenance, but a philosophical statement about the value of individual soldiers. The American military calculated nutritional requirements and ensured delivery of sufficient calories, vitamins, proteins. Japanese soldiers, by contrast, often subsisted on rice balls and pickled vegetables, and by the final months of the war subsisted on whatever they could forage. On Okinawa, as supply lines collapsed, Japanese troops ate grass, roots, snails. American troops complained about the monotony of Spam. The contrast was not about cuisine, but about civilizational capacity. When Sullivan's unit overran a Japanese position near Yanabaru, they found in the bunker a single bag of rice, carefully portioned, and a diary belonging to Lieutenant Yamada, who had died in the bombardment. The diary's final entries described the diminishing rations, the impossibility of resupply, the growing awareness that they had been ordered to hold a position that could not be held. One passage stood out. "The Americans fire more shells in a single barrage than we have for the entire week. I do not know how to fight an enemy who can be so wasteful." That word, wasteful, captured the cognitive dissonance. What looked like waste from one perspective was overwhelming abundance from another. The Americans could afford to saturate grid squares with artillery because they had factories producing shells faster than armies could fire them. The Kamikaze campaign continued through June, wave after wave of attacks that grew increasingly desperate and decreasingly effective. Pilots who had trained for months were replaced by pilots who had trained for weeks, then days. The quality of aircraft declined, mechanical failures increased, the coordination of attacks deteriorated. By the final sorties, some pilots flew jury-rigged trainers loaded with bombs, aircraft never designed for combat, piloted by teenagers who barely knew how to maintain altitude. The divine wind had become a whisper, then a wheeze, then silence. On June 22, 1945, organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa collapsed. The battle had cost the Americans 12,000 dead and 36,000 wounded. It had cost the Japanese over 100,000 military dead, countless civilian casualties, and the last credible defense before the home islands. The kamikaze attacks had sunk dozens of ships and damaged hundreds more, inflicting more naval casualties than any prior campaign. And yet the fleet remained. The invasion proceeded. The tanks kept advancing. For every kamikaze that struck true, 10 more died achieving nothing. And behind every damaged ship sailed 10 more undamaged vessels. The mathematics of devotion could not overcome the mathematics of production.
Sullivan survived Okinawa. He would later tell his grandson about the moment he understood the war was won, not from any particular battle or heroic action, but from the simple observation that when his tank threw a tread on a muddy hillside, a recovery vehicle appeared within 2 hours with a replacement tread, new tools, and hot coffee for the crew. The Japanese, he knew from interrogation reports, often abandoned disabled tanks because they lacked the parts and fuel to recover them. "We didn't beat them because we were braver," Sullivan said 50 years later, hands still steady at 91. "We beat them because when our stuff broke, we could fix it. When their stuff broke, it stayed broken." The kamikaze represented the ultimate expression of a philosophy that valued spirit over materiel, sacrifice over calculation, the purity of intention over the vulgarity of industrial output. It was beautiful in its way, and it was tragic, and it was utterly insufficient. The pilots who dove into the Pacific believed their deaths would purchase strategic outcomes. They believed that American resolve would break before Japanese determination. They believed that quality of spirit could substitute for quantity of resources. They were wrong not because they lacked courage they possessed in abundance, but because the war they thought they were fighting was not the war that was actually being waged. The larger truth that emerges from the smoke and the wreckage and the endless advance of American armor is this: World War II was not decided by the willingness to die, but by the capacity to produce. Democracies, which the Axis powers viewed as decadent and weak, proved capable of mobilizing resources at scales that authoritarian efficiency could not match. The consent-based societies that Japanese militarists dismissed as spiritually bankrupt outproduced, outsupplied, and ultimately overwhelmed forces animated by martial ideology. The American worker assembling Sherman tanks in Detroit, the Rosie the Riveter welding aircraft fuselages in California, the farmers increasing crop yields to feed both civilian and military populations, these were the unsung kamikaze of the Allied cause, sacrificing not their lives, but their comfort, their normalcy, their peacetime expectations to create the material conditions that rendered Japanese sacrifice strategically irrelevant. The tanks kept advancing not because American soldiers were willing to die, but because American society was willing to produce. That willingness, that capacity to transform economies and marshal resources through democratic consensus rather than authoritarian decree, proved more powerful than any divine wind. In the end, the Kamikaze did not fail because they lacked conviction. They failed because conviction, however pure, cannot sink a fleet that can replace its losses faster than attackers can inflict them. The sky above Okinawa eventually cleared. The burning ships were towed to harbor or repaired at sea. The replacements for the fallen arrived on schedule, and the tanks, inevitable as tides, continued their advance toward an empire that had confused the poetry of sacrifice with the prose of victory, and discovered too late that the latter requires not heroes willing to die, but nations capable of outproducing death itself.